Della Hart read her husband's will standing up, because the lawyer's office had only 2 chairs and her husband's brother had taken both of them. The estate split 3 ways in under a minute. The ranch and the water rights and the brick house on Center Street went to the brother. The grazing leases went to a cousin who had not spoken to anyone in 9 years. And to Adeline Hart, widow, the paper said, the dwelling known locally as the Eagle Step Cabin, together with the 11 acres of cliff and slot beneath it, the same being inaccessible by road or trail and of no assessed value. Garrett Hart laughed before the lawyer finished the sentence. He was her husband's older brother, broad through the chest, a watch chain across a vest that had cost more than Della's wagon. And he laughed the easy way a man laughs when a thing has gone exactly as he arranged it. "Eagle Step," he said, and looked around the room for someone to share it with. "She gets the goat shelf." Tom always did have a sense of humor. The clerk by the door snorted. The cousin's lawyer smiled down at his shoes. Garrett leaned back until the chair creaked under him and folded his hands over the watch chain and said it again, slower, so the word would stick. The goat shelf. And it did stick. By supper, that name had walked the length of town. The widow Hart, who got the goat shelf. And not one of them stopped to ask the only question worth asking. Why would a careful man like Tom Hart leave the whole of his life to the brother who kept his books and leave his own wife nothing but a cabin no living soul could reach? Through the office window, Della's old mule lifted his head at the rail and turned both ears toward the door, toward her, before her hand touched the latch. Garrett's blooded saddle horse beside him never flicked a fly. The animal knew which of the 2 people arguing in that room told the truth, and had known it for years. "You'll want to read me the part about the water," Della said. Her voice was level and it carried, and the room quieted, surprised that the goat shelf had spoken. "The Dry Fork allotment. Read me whose name it's under now." The lawyer glanced at Garrett. Garrett answered for him, smiling. "It's under mine, Adeline, as is right. A woman can't run a freight herd, and you know it. I'm doing you a kindness here. There's not a soul in this county would let a widow drive cattle to the railhead alone, and I won't see Tom's name embarrassed by the trying." "My name," Della said, "not Tom's. Mine and Tom's on a deed I watched the recorder stamp the year we married." "Then it's a mercy that deed was settled before he passed," Garrett said, gentle as a man laying a blanket over a child, "because settled it was. You'll see the signature. Now sit down. There's no chair, I know, but sit down anyway in the way of speaking, and let men who understand these things carry the weight off you." She did not sit down. She took the will and ran one finger down the page the way she had run it down 1,000 columns, and she saw what no one else in that warm room had thought to look for: the creases. It had been folded into quarters and read flat again, more than once by other hands, before it ever reached hers. A will that is only signed and witnessed gets folded one time and put away. A will that has been worked on gets folded and unfolded until the paper goes soft at the fold, and this one was soft. She said nothing about it. She put the will inside her coat against her ribs and let the men congratulate themselves. She was 38 years old that October. She had buried a husband 11 days before. She had $4.60 and a wagon and a mule named Pilot, and she had just been handed a cabin that no living person in the county had set foot inside in a generation, because the only way down to it was a sandstone crack a man could not ride and most could not climb. Garrett was still talking when she walked out. He was explaining to the lawyer, in the warm, patient voice of a man being generous, that he would of course buy the worthless cliff parcel off his poor brother's widow for, say, $30, just to spare her the embarrassment of owning a thing she could never reach. Just to be kind. He said the word kind twice, and the second time he said it loud enough to follow her into the street. Outside, Pilot made the low chest sound he made for one person only and pulled at the rail to come to her, and that small certain thing steadied her more than anything any man had said in that room. She stood with her forehead against his warm neck for a moment in the dust of Center Street and breathed and let the watch-chain voice go on behind the office glass without her. If you are the kind of person who believes a quiet woman everyone has written off is usually the one holding the page that matters, then you and Della are going to get along, and you should follow along with her, because the men in that office have made the oldest mistake there is, and the rest of this is the story of what it costs them. She did not drive home. She drove south, out the Pariah Road toward the Rimrock, because she wanted to see the thing she now owned before she decided what owning it meant. Here is what the town did not know, because it had never once thought to ask. Della Hart had not always been a rancher's wife. Before Tom, before this county, she had kept the books for her father's freight office in Cedar City for 11 years, from the age of 15, and she could read a ledger the way other folks read weather coming. Her father was a fair-dealing freighter named Soren Vance, a Danish immigrant with bad English and flawless arithmetic, and he had decided early that his daughter's eyes were sharper than any clerks he could hire. He used to set a stranger's account book in front of her at the kitchen table and lay his pocket watch beside it, open, ticking, and say one word, "Find it." And she would run her finger down the columns until she found the figure that had been salted in, the entry written to be believed instead of written down because it was true. By 16, she could do it in under 2 minutes every time and tell him which line had been added last by the way the ink sat heavier and blacker where the pen had hesitated. "A clean column has a sound," her father told her, tapping the page. "It does not lie because it cannot. A man can argue, a preacher can argue, a sum cannot. It adds or it does not, and it does not care whose feelings it hurts." He had said it so many times it had worn smooth in her, the way a stone wears in a pocket, and she had thought it was only bookkeeping. She did not know yet that she had been raised to be the one witness a thief like Garrett Hart could not buy, frighten, or charm, because she had no use for any of the 3 things he traded in. She had not told Tom's people any of that. They had decided what she was the day she married in, a quiet, plain woman, useful in a kitchen, ornamental at church, and people who have decided a thing rarely trouble to check it. Tom had known. Tom had teased her about it on their good nights, called her his ledger, said she could hear a lie in a number across a dark room. She had let it be a private joke between them. She understood now, standing in the cold of that street, that her husband had not been joking, and that he had remembered something about her that she had half forgotten about herself. The rim road gave out at a juniper snag, and she walked the last half-mile leading Pilot, and then she stood at the edge of the world and looked down at the goat shelf. It was not a shelf, From the brick house in town, from the comfortable distance at which Garrett Hart had spent his whole life looking at things it might have read as a smudge on the cliff, from the edge it was a cabin, a real one, squat and silver gray, built of cedar logs gone the color of old bone, tucked under a brow of red sandstone 200 feet down on a bench no wider than a barn. A stovepipe stood up through the roof, rusted but whole. A line of pale dust ran along the bench that her bookkeeper's eye read at once as a path, worn, walked many times by one set of boots. The crack that led down was a slot in the rock barely shoulder-wide, choked with rockfall, falling away into shadow. No road, no trail a horse could take. A place built by someone who did not want to be reached, for a reason, and Della stood at the top of it in the cooling light and felt the first thing she had felt in 11 days that was not grief and was not anger. She felt curious. Why would Tom build a house no one could reach and then leave it in writing to the one person on earth he knew could read what was inside? She did not go down that first evening. The light was failing and the slot was no place to learn in the dark. She made a cold camp at the snag with the mule and watched the dark pour up the canyon from the bottom, blue and slow, the way water fills a cup. And she thought about the off-front wheel, because there was a thing she had not let herself look at straight. Tom had died on the grade above this gorge, thrown from the wagon seat when the off-front wheel split going down the slope, and the county had called it an old crack in the fellow, a mercy, quick. But Tom checked every wheel on every wagon the night before a haul. She had watched him do it 10,000 times, kneeling at each hub with a lantern and a tap hammer, listening. A sound wheel rings, a cracked one thuds, and he had never once in their marriage missed a bad wheel. She had told herself that even careful men miss things. She had needed to tell herself that to get through the burying. Up here at the edge of his secret house, she found she no longer needed to. The climb down took her the better part of 2 hours the next morning, and she did it in a dead woman's good wool, because she owned no better, her skirts knotted up out of the way. The slot was worse than it looked, and then in 2 places better, because someone had cut hand holds into the sandstone, old ones, rounded and recut, the kind of work a man does over many quiet trips when he does not want a single soul to know he is going down. She found a peg of cedar driven into a seam at the hardest pitch, smoothed dark by a hand that had gripped it many times, and she knew the whittling the way she knew her own name. Tom's hand. The realization moved through her cold and certain. Her husband had come here over and over alone for years and had never once said the word Eagle's Step in their kitchen. Halfway down, wedged in a dry crack where no rain could reach it, she found a tin, a small flat tobacco tin, the kind Tom carried, and inside it not tobacco, but a stub of pencil and a folded slip of paper with 3 words in his fast hand, "Keep coming down," as if he had known that whoever read the will and came to the rim would lose their nerve at the bad pitch and want a reason to turn back, as if he had left a hand on the rock to push her on. She put the tin in her coat with the will and kept coming down. She reached the bench as the morning light went gold along the top of the far wall, and the canyon below her still lay blue with the last of the night. The cabin door was latched from the outside with a wooden bar, which meant no one was keeping anyone in and someone had been keeping the weather out. Inside it was one room, dry as a drum, smelling of cedar and cold ash and dust, a rope bed, tight and made, a table plain smooth, 2 shelves of tinned food, peaches and beef, the can still bright, a lamp with oil in it, and a box of matches kept dry in wax paper, a man's spare coat on a peg, Tom's, that still held the faint shape of his shoulders, and against the north wall, squat and black and cold, a cast-iron cook stove, the old kind, with a firebox and a warming shelf and a name cast into the door, Buckwalter, Provo, the only thing in that one room that a man had paid real money to haul down a cliff on his own back, piece by piece, which no one would do for a cabin he meant to cook in once a year. She lit the lamp, though it was day. She sat at the dead man's plain table in the house no one could reach, and laid out the things she carried, the wheel, the tobacco tin, the slip that said keep coming down. And she tried to understand why a man who loved her would leave her a cliff and a joke and a trail of handholds cut for her hands. If you have made it this far into Della's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. What she finds behind that cold stove is the whole reason her husband built this place. She found it because she was cold. The second morning, she went to lay a fire, because the bench held the night's chill long past sunrise, and her breath smoked in the one room, and she knelt at the Buckwalter stove and opened the firebox to clear what she thought would be last winter's ash. There was no ash. The firebox was clean and dry, scoured, never used, a stove carried down a cliff face, one cast-iron part at a time on a man's own back, and never once lit. And when her knuckle went past the grate to feel for the damper, it struck something that did not belong in a firebox. Not iron, not stone, oilcloth. A flat-wrapped bundle had been pushed up into the dead space behind the firebox, against the backplate, into the one place in a cook stove where heat can never reach, because no fire is ever meant to be lit in it. The stove was not a stove. It was a strong box the whole county had agreed was worthless, because it sat in a house the whole county had agreed was worthless. And Garrett Hart had laughed at it from a leather chair in town. Her hands shook getting it out, and she made them stop, the way her father had taught her to still them over a stranger's books, because shaken hands tear pages, and torn pages are how the truth gets argued with. Inside the oilcloth was a ledger, a real one, half bound in green cloth gone soft at the corners, and the first thing Della saw when she opened it was her husband's hand. Not the careful public hand of letters in the will, but Tom's true scrawl, the one he used for the things that mattered only to him. The top of the first page said, in that scrawl, "The true book of the Hart Cattle Company, kept because the one Garrett shows the bank is a lie." And under it, a date 7 years gone, and under that, in a different and steadier ink, added later, "If you are reading this, it is Della and I am dead." Start at the back. The back tells you how. She did not go to the back yet. She was a bookkeeper, and a bookkeeper reads a true book from the front, because the lie is in the order things happened, and you cannot see the order from the end. She read the rest of that day and into the night, and the lamp burned low, and what the ledger told her rearranged the whole world she thought she had been living in. The ranch had never belonged to Garrett. It had been Tom's and Della's, free and clear, the homestead patent in both their names from the year they married. But Garrett, the older brother, the one with the watch chain, the one who had volunteered years back to keep the dull side of things, so Tom could ride and rope and do what he was good at, Garrett had carried the company's books. And Tom, who could gentle a green horse and read a sky and find water by the lay of the brush, could not for the life of him add a column twice and get the same answer, and he had let his brother carry it, because that is what you do with the brother you trust. The green ledger was Tom catching up. He had taught himself, slow and furious page by clumsy page, to do the thing his wife could do in her sleep, and he had been keeping a true count for 7 years against the false one Garrett showed the bank. Della read the entries the way she had been raised to, and they told a clean and ugly story. Cattle that Garrett's book recorded as dead of blackleg, 81 head one year, 63 the next, were entered here, driven to the railhead at Milford, and sold for cash, the money never once reaching the ranch account. A spring that Garrett's book called Dry and Let Laps Off the Water Rolls was entered here, flowing fine, the laps arranged so Garrett could file the allotment over again under his own name alone. And there, on a facing page near the middle, Tom had copied out by hand a promissory note for $2,400, taken against the ranch in Tom's name, that Tom swore on the page he never signed. And beneath the copied signature, Tom had written, "G's hand, not mine. He makes the H with the loop coming up like a J. I never have. Look at any letter I ever sent you. Look at our own deed." Della held the will up beside the page in the failing lamplight and looked at the signature transferring everything to Garrett, and there it was, the H made like a J, the loop coming up where Tom's loop never went. She had signed her name beside that same H on her own wedding deed 11 years before, and she knew her husband's hand the way she knew his step on the porch. Tom had not signed the ranch away, and then she turned to the back of the book, where he had told her to start, and learned that Tom had not died of a wheel either. The last pages were the hardest, and they were written smaller and faster. The hand of a man who has begun to be afraid and is racing it. Tom had written that Garrett knew he was being watched. He had written that he had told Garrett 3 weeks before he died that the books did not agree, and that he meant to take both to a federal examiner in Salt Lake and let an honest man decide between them. And he had written one line, dated 19 days before the grade above the gorge took him. "If the off-front wheel ever goes on the downgrade, know that it was looked at the night before by a man who is not me, and the man with the lantern was Roan Pickett, and Garrett pays his wages." Roan Pickett, Garrett's foreman, a slow, heavy man, and Della sat very still in the cold cabin, and remembered the night Tom died, remembered Pickett hanging about the wagon shed that evening with a lantern he did not need for any work she could name, and how she had thought nothing of it, because she had not yet learned that a man with a lantern and no reason is a man writing a death into someone else's book. She did not weep over it. She had wept already for 11 days over the wrong story. This was a different thing, and it asked for a different woman, and she found she had been that woman all along, and only set her down the day she married in. She closed the green book and wrapped it again in the oilcloth and held it against her ribs where the will had been, and the lamp guttered out, and she sat in the cabin dark and did not light it again, because she did not need light any more to know exactly what she was looking at. She climbed out of the canyon at first light, the ledger wrapped in the dead woman's wool against her back, and the climb up was easier than the climb down. the way it always is once you know what you are climbing for. At the bad pitch, she set her hand over the cedar peg Tom's hand had smoothed, and she did not pull it loose, though she could have, though it would have made a keepsake. She left it in the rock. He had cut it for the climb, and the climb was not over. Now she had a true book and a forged will, and the name of the man who tapped the wheel, and against her she had a county. So she did the one thing a county cannot fix. She did not go to the sheriff, because the sheriff played cards with Garrett on Thursdays and would warn him by Friday. She did not go to the bank, because the bank held the forged $2,400 note, and would far rather it stay real than learn it was not. She drove north instead, 2 hard days with the mule, to the one office in the territory that owed Garrett Hart nothing at all, the Federal Land Office in Beaver, where deeds and water filings and homestead patents were recorded under territorial seal, and where a tired young clerk had been posted only 14 months and disliked everyone in the country equally, and so could be bought by no one. His name was Hans Bergstrom, a thin Norwegian with ink on his cuff and spectacles mended with wire, and he looked up from his counter at the dusty woman in worn wool with no expectation of trouble. He got it anyway. She laid 3 things on his counter, side by side, the way her father had taught her to lay out a case, so a man could not look at one without seeing the next. The will, open to the transfer. The green ledger, open to the copied note and Tom's line about the loop, and the original homestead patent for the Hart Ranch, which she had found folded flat into the back cover of the ledger, both their names upon it, stamped, never canceled, never sold. "I want to file a notice of fraud against a recorded transfer," she said, in the flat, clean voice she had used at 15, reading a stranger's accounts back to her father. "And I want it stamped with today's date before one living soul in my county learns I was ever in this room." Bergstrom adjusted the wire on his spectacles and looked at the 2 signatures, the one on the deed and the one on the will. He looked at them a long time. He was not a brave man. He had taken the posting because no one else wanted it, and it was quiet, and quiet was what he liked. But he had been hired to make true marks on true paper, and he had not yet been in the country long enough to learn that the truth was meant to bend for a man like Garrett Hart. "The loop on the letter I etch," he said at last, quietly, more to himself than to her. "It does not match." He set the 2 documents down precisely. "These are not the same hand." "No," said Della, "they are not." He stamped it. He stamped all of it. The notice of fraud, the certified copies, and he entered the original patent back onto the record where Garrett's transfer had quietly buried it, his pen moving in the small, exact strokes of a man who has decided just this once to be the thing he was hired to be. "This will go very hard for you," he said, sliding the certified copy across the counter, and for the first time he met her eyes. "He has the sheriff, and he has the bank." "He has a book that lies," Della said, taking it. "I have the book that doesn't. I was raised by a man who taught me the second one always wins, given a little air and an honest hand to read it." Garrett heard she was back in the county within a day of her return. He did not hear what she carried, because she told no one. And a man who has built his whole life on a false book sleeps badly only on the night he learns the true one has been found. For 3 weeks, Garrett slept fine. He let it be known around town in his warm and generous way that the widow had finally seen sense and would be selling him the goat shelf, and that he might even let her stay on in a back room at the ranch out of pure Christian feeling, family being family. He told the men at the bank he was a patient man, and patient men got what they waited for. The first test came on a cold morning 2 weeks in, and it nearly took her. The sheriff rode out to the rim road with 2 men and a paper, and he found Della at the snag where she had made her camp, while the new trail was being thought through. The paper was a county order, a charge of removing a fixture, a cook stove, the lawful property of the Hart estate, from a dwelling, with intent to deprive the heir, meaning Garrett. It was nonsense, and the sheriff half knew it, but it was a hook, and the point of it was plain. Get her into the county jail on a small thing, and search her wagon, and her camp, and her person, for whatever it was the widow had hauled up out of that canyon, because Garrett had begun at last to wonder. "You'll come in and answer it, Adeline," the sheriff said, not unkindly, a man doing a thing he had been told to do. "It'll go easier if you bring along whatever you took out of the goat shelf. Garrett says there's items of the estate gone missing." For one cold breath, Della felt the whole thing tilt. The ledger was in the wagon, rolled in the dead woman's wool under the seat-board, and if they searched the wagon it was over, the witness in Garrett's hands before any honest man had read it, and a fire would take care of the rest. Her father's voice came up in her then, the kitchen voice, the open watch ticking. "Do not let them rush you. The lie is always in a hurry. The truth can wait." "I haven't taken any stove anywhere, Sheriff," she said, slow and plain, and it was the truth. The buckwalter still stood against the north wall down on the bench. "Stove's where Tom said it. You're welcome to send a man down the crack to count it. As for the rest—" And here she did the thing her father had timed her on. She handed him a paper to look at so he would stop looking at the wagon. She handed him a certified copy of the corrected patent, Bergstrom's territorial seal bright on the bottom, both Hart names restored, the transfer to Garrett struck through by the recorder's own hand. "You'll want to read that before you arrest the lawful owner of this parcel for stealing from herself." The sheriff read it. He was not a quick man, but he could read a federal seal, and he knew the difference between a county order he could push around and a territorial record he could not. And he knew, reading it, that the thing had gone past him to a level where his Thursday card games bought him nothing at all. He folded the order back into his coat. "I'll tell Garrett the stove's accounted for," he said, which was a way of saying he wanted no part of what was coming, and he turned his horse and took his 2 men back to town, and Della stood at the snag with her heart going hard, and did not let it show until the dust had settled all the way down the Pariah Road. The certified copy had turned them at the gate, but it was only a copy of the deed. The ledger, the witness, the thing that hanged a man instead of merely embarrassing him, that was still under the seat-board, and she understood now that as long as she was the only one who held it, they would keep coming, on smaller and smaller hooks, until one of them caught. A witness no one else has read is a witness one fire can silence. So she did the second thing a county cannot fix. She put the witness where a great many honest strangers could see it at once. The thing she had filed in Beaver had been quietly traveling at its own pace all this while, the way true paper does. The land office had forwarded the fraud notice and the corrected patent to the territorial recorder in Salt Lake, and the territorial recorder, seeing a forged transfer of a federally patented homestead, had done the only thing the law allowed him. He had forwarded the whole of it to a federal examiner because a forged patent transfer was never a county matter and never had been, and the examiner answered to Washington and not to anyone Garrett Hart had ever shaken hands with. You cannot buy a man you have never been introduced to. The first Garrett knew of any of it was the morning a deputy United States Marshal rode into the county Garrett thought he owned and asked, at the brick house on Center Street, for a man named Garrett Hart, regarding a question about a signature on a homestead patent and a note of $2,400. Della gave the examiner the Green Ledger then, not the copy. The book itself, Tom's True Book, carried into the hearing in Beaver in the oilcloth her husband had wrapped it in, because she had learned that the moment a witness is shared widely, it can no longer be silenced quietly. She kept nothing back. She had Bergstrom's certified copies for herself. The original she set into the examiner's hands across the table and watched a federal man's face change as he read a dead rancher's 7-year accounting of his own brother. There was no county trial. There was a federal examiner's hearing in a plain room in Beaver, and it ran 4 days. And Della sat through every hour of it in the front row in the dead woman's good wool, the mule tied outside because she trusted no stable in that country, and she spoke only when she was asked. Garrett's lawyer, a different, costlier man than the one with the 2 chairs, tried first to say the Green Book was a forgery, a grieving widow's invention. The examiner sent for the bank's own loan record and laid the copied note in the ledger beside the original note the bank held, and they were the same down to the figure and the date, which a widow inventing a book could not have known. The lawyer tried next to say the cattle sales were ordinary, that beasts die of blackleg and the count was honest. The examiner had already sent a writer to Milford to the railhead's own stock sale book, kept by men who had never heard of Garrett Hart, and head for head, 81 and 63. The railhead's bright, honest count matched the Green Ledgers and damned the brothers. Garrett had built his whole life on the certainty that no one would ever bother to read one book against another. He had never once imagined a woman who had been raised to do precisely that, with an open watch ticking beside the page. On the 3rd day, the examiner asked Della directly how she had known where to look. She stood. "My husband left me the only thing he had left to leave," she said, "a cold stove in a house no one in this county would walk out to. He left it to me because I am the one person he knew could read what was inside it, and because the men who had decided otherwise about me would never think to look in a thing they had already laughed at. I read it. That is the one thing in this world I have always known how to do, and not one man in my county ever once thought to ask me whether I could." She said it without heat. She had no heat left for Garrett Hart. He had spent it all on her at the lawyer's table, and a column of numbers, her father used to say, does not care in the least how anyone feels. When she had finished, Garrett tried to speak. Half rose, the watch chain catching the light, the warm, generous voice starting up the way it had started up at the lawyer's table. "Now, if I may explain to these gentlemen the way a working ranch keeps its books," and the examiner, a tired man from Washington, with no Thursday card game and no debt to any heart, told him to sit down, and he sat. It was the first time in his life a room had told Garrett Hart to sit down and meant it, and he sat. And that was the whole of his humbling, and it was enough. The finding came down in March on territorial paper under a federal seal Garrett could not reach. The transfer of the patent was set aside as fraudulent and void. The forged note was struck. The bank left holding its own bad paper for having taken it. The ranch and the water and the house on Center Street were restored to Adeline Hart, lawful holder, the patent corrected to read as it had read the year she married, her name and Tom's, free and clear, and the matter of the off-front wheel and of a foreman named Rowan Pickett, who had hung about a wagon shed with a lantern and no work to do, was bound over to a grand jury, which is a slower and heavier kind of book, and one that does not close. Rowan Pickett did not wait for it. He ran for the territory line the night the marshal first came, and was picked up at a horse camp near the border with a saddle that did not match his story and a story that did not match the wheel. And after that, no one in the county said his name aloud, the way you do not say aloud the name of a thing you are ashamed to have stood next to. Garrett Hart did not run, because Garrett Hart had never in his life run from anything, nothing having ever chased him. He stayed in the brick house that was no longer his until the corrected patent put him out of it, and on a gray morning in early spring he walked down the steps of the house on Center Street with 2 trunks and the watch chain and got into a hired buggy to be driven north to answer the federal charge. And the town that had repeated the joke about the goat shelf all winter stood along the street and watched him go, and did not laugh, and did not call out, and did not say one word at all. Della watched him go too, but not from the street. She watched from the rim road, from the edge of the 11 acres of cliff and slot the will had called of no value, with the mule cropping the thin grass behind her. She did not go down to the buggy. She had nothing left to say to him, and he had nothing left to take. She only stood at the top of the place no one could reach, and watched the man who had reached for everything be driven slowly away from all of it, and then she turned her back on the road and went down her own new trail, hand over the cedar peg, to the house her husband had built around the truth. She had the trail cut that summer with the money from the sale of the brick house, which she would not live in. Money the Green Ledger had proven was bought with cattle stolen out of her own herd, and which she felt clean spending only on this. Switchbacks blasted into the slot, an iron rail set into the rock at the 2 bad pitches, beside the old cedar peg, which she made the men leave in place, though it served no purpose now but memory, and at the bottom, on the bench no wider than a barn, the cabin, kept exactly as Tom had built it. She kept the Buckwalter stove right where it stood against the north wall, and she never once lit a fire in it all the rest of her years. When folks who had earned the right to know would ask her why a woman would keep a cold stove in a cold house and burn her wood in a little sheet iron camp stove instead, she would open the firebox and let them feel the empty dark behind the back plate. And she would say only that some stoves are built to keep a thing safe, not to burn it, and that she had buried a man who knew the difference. She lived her later years more on the Eagle Step bench than at the ranch. And folks who had once carried the joke the length of town now drove the long way out the Pariah Road and down the new switchbacks to sit at her plain table. Because a woman who can read a true book is a useful neighbor to have when you suspect your own affairs do not add. A few of them, the honest few, the ones who came with a real worry and an open book, she taught. She taught them to find the salted figure, to feel the heavier ink where a pen has hesitated over a lie, to hear, as her father had taught her to hear, The difference between a number written to be believed and a number written down, because it is true. The mule grew old in the corral she cut into the bench and lifted his head for her step. Until the morning he did not, and she buried him at the foot of the slot, the one creature in the whole early bad time who had never once doubted that she knew exactly where she was going. Years on, the county assessor sent a young man out to set a value on the Eagle Step parcel for the tax rolls, and he climbed down the new trail and stood in the one dry room with his book, and wrote in it that the dwelling was of no particular worth, very nearly the same words the will had used the day Garrett Hart laughed. Della read it over his shoulder and almost smiled, and let it stand, and signed where he asked her to sign. Her own H, the loop, going where her husband's had always gone. She had learned that the most valuable thing a person can own is very often the one thing everyone else has already agreed to overlook. A house no one can reach is the only house no one can take. And what an honest hand writes down outlasts every man who hoped it would burn. For a column of numbers she had been taught at her father's table is a witness that never dies and never once gets scared. So if it had been you at that lawyer's table, with the laughter going round the room and 30 easy dollars lying on the offer, would you have signed the goat shelf away and kept your warm chair in town? Or would you have gone down the crack in the rock alone to read what a dead man took such care to leave you?